The storm arrived without mercy on the 5th of October, wrapping the Appalachian foothills in a crystalline tomb that would last 12 days. Jack Morrison stood on his porch before dawn, watching the thermometer drop past -18 Fahrenheit, his steel-gray eyes tracking the weight accumulating on the power lines. 1 inch of ice, maybe closer to 1 1/4, with more frozen precipitation falling every hour. The accumulation was accelerating rather than stabilizing. His left leg ached with the familiar throb that always preceded pressure systems, a souvenir from an IED outside Kandahar 8 years prior. The scar on his left temple felt tight in the cold, that nervous tick in damaged tissue responding to dropping barometric pressure. Beside him, Ranger's ears rotated in that hyper-alert posture, the Belgian Malinois' muscular frame tense beneath his faded olive tactical vest. The dog's 300 million olfactory receptors were already processing information Jack couldn't perceive. The electrical hum of transformers struggling under impossible weight, the faint chemical signature of moisture in the air that would soon freeze everything into immobility, the metallic smell of ozone from power grid stress. Ice, just ice. That simple word contained multitudes of danger, and both man and dog understood it perfectly. "Easy, boy," Jack murmured, running his calloused hand along Ranger's black mask, feeling the smooth, cool fur beneath his fingertips. The dog's muscles were tense, ready for what instinct told him was coming. "We've done this before." But they hadn't done this together in these mountains. Jack had weathered combat zones across 2 continents, cleared hostile territory in Helmand Province and Kandahar, taught himself masonry and engineering through necessity and obsession, born from 3 tours of duty. He'd built his underground shelter using ancient Roman hypocaust principles, a combustion chamber with brick labyrinth designed to capture 85 to 90% of the heat that ordinary wood stoves wasted. The Romans had understood something fundamental about survival. You didn't fight the elements directly. You redirected them, channeled them, used their own power against them. That philosophy had kept soldiers alive in brutally cold mountain warfare. It would keep these people alive, too. He'd stockpiled 6 cords of seasoned oak, each piece measured and documented in his logbook, and stacked in the shelter's designated wood storage chamber. Installed gravity-fed water from the spring 300 feet upslope. No pumps, no electricity required. Just elevation and gravity doing the work humans couldn't maintain in power failures. Dug a root cellar deep into the mountainside with his own hands, with Ranger watching from the shelter entrance. The fieldstone and clay structure he'd spent 3 months perfecting would sustain 55 degrees Fahrenheit, even in -20 conditions. 4 feet wide, 7 feet tall, every dimension calculated, every angle precise. The combustion chamber itself was a masterpiece of energy capture. Hot gases spiraled through multiple brick passages, each pass extracting calories, cooling the exhaust by the time it exited the chimney. Maximum efficiency, minimum waste. He'd measured everything twice. No, 3 times. Military training had taught him that precision kept people alive. By day 2, the power grid had surrendered completely. Transformers exploded in showers of sparks up and down the hollow, the crack, crack, crack of ice-laden tree limbs breaking under accumulation that climbed beyond 1 inch. The sound was like gunfire, distinct, devastating, final. Jack stood in his shelter entrance and listened to the mountain break apart. The temperature had plummeted to -12 Fahrenheit, and the ice weight on vegetation had crossed the critical threshold. Trees that had stood for 70 years were snapping like kindling. Power lines hung in twisted tangles, transformers darkened, the mechanical hum of the grid replaced by a terrible silence. His nearest neighbor, Dale Crenshaw, he lived 3/4 of a mile downhill, or rather, would have lived there. Jack hadn't seen Dale in 6 days. Dale was a practical man, 73, weather-beaten, with the stubborn pride of someone who'd lived through 3 ice storms, relying on nothing but a fireplace and determination. "Your grandfather didn't need all this," Dale had said 2 weeks prior, standing in Jack's driveway while Jack was organizing materials for the heater. Gesturing dismissively at the fieldstones stacked for the construction, the supplies being organized. All this prepping nonsense. People survived ice storms for 100 years without generators and fancy heating systems. They survived because they had community, neighbors helping neighbors, not all this isolationist bunker mentality. Jack had listened without responding. Dale had lived through ice storms, yes. But how many of his neighbors had died? How many people had Jack known in villages throughout Helmand and Kandahar who'd faced catastrophe with exactly Dale's philosophy? That the old ways were sufficient, that asking for help was weakness, that preparation was paranoia. He'd learned long ago during his combat engineering tours that some people needed to touch the stove themselves, needed the immediate confirmation of pain before they believed the danger was real. Day 4 brought Dale to Jack's door at 3 in the afternoon, his lips tinged with the pale blue of early frostbite, his hands trembling so badly he couldn't turn the doorknob. His breath came in shallow gasps, yet behind his eyes was the shock of a man whose certainty had shattered like the icicles hanging from the eaves, each one a foot long now, catching what little light penetrated the ice-gray sky. "I was wrong," Dale said simply, and Jack pulled him inside without hesitation, without judgment, without the satisfaction of being proven correct. Such satisfaction was for people who weren't fighting for survival. "Come," Jack said quietly, and he wrapped Dale in blankets, positioned him near the heater's radiant warmth, and waited for the shaking to subside. Jack examined Dale's hands, early frostbite on the fingertips, pale waxy coloring, the tissue damage already beginning. Another 6 hours outside, maybe less, and Dale would have lost fingers permanently. Another 12 hours, and he would have lost a limb. That was the mathematics of cold. By sunset, 18 people had found their way to the shelter. Jack distributed them systematically, elderly near the heater's direct warmth, children positioned where they could benefit from body heat. By day 6, the number had grown to 23, neighbors from the wider hollow, families whose generators had failed, whose heating oil trucks couldn't reach through the ice-locked roads, whose courage had finally buckled under the weight of hypothermia's seductive whisper. The cold was a psychological weapon as much as a physical one. It wore you down through hours of discomfort, through the constant calculation of calorie burn versus available resources, through the slow erosion of hope. 23 people now depending on Jack Morrison's preparation and the ancient principles of thermal mass and combustion chemistry. By 23 people whose lives had narrowed to a single focus, the warmth of the rocket mass heater and trust that the shelter would hold. Jack managed the shelter with the same methodical competence he'd brought to clearance operations in Helmand Province. He'd cleared hostile territory before. Now he cleared a path through crisis. The rocket mass heater's performance exceeded projections. He'd engineered it to leverage 4 cords of seasoned oak into continuous distributed warmth across the underground space. the combustion process yielding 90% thermal efficiency compared to the 20 to 30% waste of conventional stoves. The heater was currently consuming approximately 2/3 of a cord per day to maintain 55 degrees in the basement chamber, which meant they had enough wood for perhaps 9 more days if consumption remained constant. He factored in the rescue timeline. 3 days remaining until National Guard breakthrough was projected. Margins. Always maintain margins for error. He drilled the community on rationing with the precision of a military quartermaster. 40 grams of stored food per person daily, supplemented by root cellar provisions. Canned vegetables, dried beans, preserved fruits, jarred meat stock. That had seemed obsessive just weeks before. "We have enough," he told them during the first shelter meeting. "We have enough if we're measured about it. No waste, no excess, no panic eating. 40 grams per person means 23 people consume approximately 920 grams daily. We have provisions for 30 days. He didn't tell them they were only planning for 12. He didn't need to. The windows showed the ice accumulation. The thermometer showed the cold. They understood they were living on Jack Morrison's preparation, and preparation was finite. The water system gravity-fed perfectly, cold and clean from the spring 300 feet above the shelter, requiring nothing but collection, storage, and distribution. Nothing but his foresight and their obedience to a system designed to keep them alive. Jack demonstrated the water collection process to several of the younger men. Show them, teach them, make them understand that survival systems aren't magical. They're mechanical, logical, reproducible. A child of 8 could operate the water system if taught properly. Continuity, redundancy. These were the principles that kept people alive when equipment failed. Ranger moved through the shelter with quiet purpose, his alert ears rotating independently to track every sound. The crack of firewood being fed into the combustion chamber, the soft murmur of community conversation, the hum of the heater system working, the creak of the earth itself as ice weight pressed down on the mountain. His sensitive nose cataloged the mineral composition of earth walls, the metal tang of the heating system, the wood smoke, the layered sense of fear and relief and human endurance compressed into underground space. 400 people in a typical household would produce ambient scent profiles that changed hour by hour. Sweat, breath, cooking, human waste. Emotion itself had a chemical signature. Ranger's 300 million olfactory receptors processed this entire spectrum simultaneously. He wasn't just smelling. He was reading an olfactory narrative written in parts per million. On day 8, as ice continued its relentless accumulation outside, and the wind carried temperatures that approached -20, Ranger's behavior changed fundamentally. His focused intensity concentrated on the western corner of the basement, the wall that intersected Dale's original foundation, the property line marked by aging copper plumbing that had settled beneath decades of ice and thaw cycles. For 2 days, his nose had been tracking an increasingly intense chemical signature, mercaptan, the sulfur compound that natural gas distributors added to make leaks detectable to human senses. Your Ranger could detect mercaptan at concentrations below 1 part per million. This concentration was already at least 50 times detectable threshold and climbing. Ranger barked. Not the general alarm bark of an ordinary watchdog protecting territory, but the specific, purposeful bark he'd been trained for. The alert bark that meant danger requiring immediate human investigation. Jack recognized it immediately. The same bark that had preceded IED discoveries in Sangin, the bark that had saved lives during multiple deployments, the bark that had prevented casualties when others missed the signs. "Show me," he commanded, his voice cutting through the shelter's ambient sounds with military clarity. Ranger led him directly to the western corner, his nose locked on a specific point on the stone wall. Jack shined his light across the surface and saw it. A hairline crack in the copper gas line, barely 2 millimeters wide, barely visible even when Jack knew where to look. The crack had formed from ground shift, caused by the enormous ice weight that had accumulated above, ice pressing down on soil, soil compacting and settling, foundation walls shifting by fractions of an inch. The copper line, brittle in the cold, had failed at the stress point. The crack had been widening for hours, maybe days. Mercaptan, the sulfur compound added to natural gas specifically to make leaks detectable, hung in the air at dangerous concentration levels. Jack could smell it now that he was aware. That distinctive rotten egg odor mixing with the earth and stone and cold. A spark, a flame, any ignition source in the correct mix, and the explosive envelope would form. 5 to 15% concentration was the deadly zone, the ratio of gas to air that transformed enclosed shelters into tombs and charred remains. At current leak rate, they were approaching the lower threshold of that envelope. Jack moved with military precision, every motion deliberate and purposeful. He isolated the gas line immediately, shutting off the main valve at its source outside, a process that required breaking through 18 inches of accumulated ice to reach the buried regulator. His hands were numb by the time he succeeded, but the valve turned and the flow stopped. He ventilated the basement, positioning 4 rescue blankets as makeshift barriers between the contaminated space and the main shelter chamber, ensuring the 23 people stayed upwind of any residual gas dispersal. Ranger stayed at his side throughout, the dog's behavior shifting to a lower alert as Jack worked, as if the animal understood that the crisis was being managed, that the handler had perceived the threat and was neutralizing it with competence. By evening, the backup heating was purely the rocket mass heater now, burning cleaner, producing no gas signature, providing steady amber glow warmth that the community had begun to depend upon absolutely. When rescue teams finally reached the hollow on day 12, after the National Guard pushed through on ice-breaking equipment, after snowplows had struggled mile by mile to restore passage, and after the State Highway Department had deployed salt and chemical melts and military personnel worked around the clock, they found Jack's shelter at 54 degrees Fahrenheit. All 23 people were alive, adequately hydrated, rationed, but stable, walking out under their own power, even the children. No hypothermia casualties, no gas poisoning, no explosions. The hazmat team entered the basement with detection equipment and found the obvious: the isolated gas line, the 2-millimeter crack, the residual mercaptan scent still faintly present despite Jack's ventilation measures. The structural assessment afterward would calculate the gas leak's explosive potential with grim precision. In the confined space of a basement shelter, with full dispersal possible over 12 hours of continued leakage, the casualty rate would have approached 100%. The hazmat officer's report stated clearly, 5 to 15% concentration in the given volume created an explosive envelope with yield equivalent to multiple charges detonating simultaneously in a stone box. Everyone would have died. 23 people, including the 4 children, ages 6, 8, 9, and 11, who'd been sleeping near the shelter's eastern wall, just 30 feet from the source of the leak. The explosion would have killed them instantly. the hazmat team leader, stood at the crack in the copper line, shining his light through that 2-millimeter gap, studying the hairline fracture that separated catastrophe from survival. He turned to Jack with an expression somewhere between gratitude and horror. "That's 2 millimeters," the hazmat officer said quietly. 2 millimeters wider, and it would have been at critical dispersal. Another day, maybe 18 hours. He paused. "Your dog saved every life here." Jack looked at Ranger, at those alert ears standing upright, at that black mask and the muscular frame that had been trained to detect the invisible threats that killed without warning or conscience. He understood something essential in that moment. Preparation wasn't arrogance. Engineering wasn't paranoia. Reading the landscape, understanding systems, building redundancy, listening when your best companion's instincts screamed warning. These were acts of love. The shelter's warmth hummed around them. The ancient Roman principles channeled through modern materials and modern purpose, keeping 23 people alive in a storm that would have killed them without the combination of human skill and canine alertness and stubborn refusal to accept failure as inevitable. Dale stood nearby, his frostbitten fingers wrapped in gauze, his pride finally burned away like excess heat through the labyrinth. "Your grandfather didn't need all this," he said quietly to Jack. And there was no dismissal in his voice now, only wonder. "All those ice storms, and he didn't have what you have." Jack didn't respond immediately. He put his hand on Dale's shoulder, feeling the thin fabric of his shirt beneath the blanket, feeling the residual cold still locked in Dale's body despite days of shelter warmth. Both men watched Ranger move through the shelter, the dog checking on each person methodically, his presence somehow confirmation that the immediate danger had passed. "Preparation isn't paranoia," Jack said quietly. "It's respect, respect for the power of these systems, the weather, the mountain itself. Your grandfather survived because he understood that. He knew that the old ways worked because they were forged through generations of failure and learning. I'm not doing something different. I'm just doing the same thing he did. Being ready before the disaster arrives, not after." He paused, looking at the rocket mass heater glowing softly in the shelter, the stone walls still radiating warmth into the darkness. "The difference is that your grandfather didn't have a community of 23 people depending on him. I made a choice to be able to bear that weight, to carry that responsibility." "But we needed it," Dale continued, his voice breaking slightly. "Thank God we needed it. Thank God you were ready." Outside, the wind continued to howl, and the ice continued to accumulate on a mountain that didn't care whether the people sheltering in its depths had preparation or pride. The storm had killed the difference between those two things, revealed them as equivalent in the face of absolute cold. Preparation was love made practical. Pride was love made brittle. And the people who survived were the ones who understood the distinction before the mountain taught them the hard way.